All right, let's apply these ideas to a real working example. So we need a server-side program. And in this case, I have a server-side program that returns a pretty complicated JSON object. And not only is the object pretty complicated, but the values are randomized so that every time you call the server-side program, you get different values for the various properties of that object. Then the client-side JavaScript code will call to that server-side program and specify data type JSON. When that happens, the handler function will automatically get a parsed JSON object. In other words, the string that comes back from the server will be parsed by jQuery, and the resultant JavaScript object, which is no longer a string but a real object, will be passed to the JavaScript handler. The JavaScript handler will then build a UL list. This can be kind of tedious. You have to loop down and concatenate a bunch of strings together, so it's very important that you test this functionality before you try to hook everything together. The object that I'm going to pass in from the server that then gets passed to the handler will contain a number that I treat as a font size, two colors that I treat as two strings that I treat as foreground and background colors, and an array of numbers that are going to be the list items, the entries inside the UL list. And then I need some HTML that simply has a button that starts off the process and a div or some other region that has an ID where the final results will be inserted. Okay, so the server results look something like this. I'm not going to show you the server code. It's pretty complicated, but if you want to practice, you could just make a text file that contained content just like this. The only difference is it wouldn't be randomized, but you could still do the process. So when you play around and when you do your exercises, don't worry about the fact that you don't know how to write server-side programs. You can just build a text file that looks exactly like this. And the address of that text file will be specified in your AJAX request. However, I want to show that my server-side program randomizes it, so let me go and run this server-side program, and the address is shownums. So the address of my server-side program is shownums. I'm not going to go through the code that does this. The only thing that's really tricky is the fact that I'm randomizing things. I'm changing the foreground, the background color, the size, and the numbers each time. But you could quite easily just make a file called shownums.txt and make that your address. And you could put this literal output exactly as written in the text file. However, in this case, since I have a program that randomizes it, every time I run the program, I'm clicking the reload button here, the foreground color potentially changes, the background color potentially changes, the font size potentially changes, and the list of numbers potentially change. Next, before I hook the whole process together with AJAX, I'm going to write some auxiliary JavaScript code, some helper code, that will take the information that I just showed you that's coming from the server, namely a foreground color, a background color, a font size, and an array of numbers, and build a colored UL list out of this. Now, concatenating strings together to build HTML is pretty low level and easy to get wrong. So it's important that you test this function before you hook it up to the AJAX. So make list builds a colored list. It calls the start tag function, and then it calls the list items function, and then the end tags function. And so it looks kind of right at first glance, but that can be a losing strategy to assume it's right. So I'm going to pass in a foreground color, a background color, a font size number, and an array of numbers. Let me try this interactively in jQuery first, and once this looks right, then I'll try to hook it together with AJAX. So I bring up an HTML file that loads the JavaScript file that defines the makeList function that we just looked at. I bring up Firebug, and in this case, I don't really need to interact with the page. I just need to test the function alone. So I am going to bring Firebug up in a separate window. I'm going to call makeList, the function we just showed, and it takes a foreground color. Let's just make up one red. A background color. Let's just make up one yellow. A font size, let's say 50, and an array of numbers. Let's say 1, 2, 3. And let's see if the string that this function returns looks reasonable. It builds a div with a UL inside of it, with some li elements inside of that, and then div, it looks okay. And of course, I've tested this already and debugged it already, but it's important that you follow this strategy. Concatenating strings to build HTML is low-level and error-prone. Test it before you hook the whole process together. All right, I've tested and verified that my helper function that builds a UL list out of the foreground color, background color, font size, and array of numbers works properly. So now I hook the whole process together. So I say fire off an AJAX request to the server-side program that we just illustrated that returns that JSON object. But we tell jQuery, hey, I want this treated as JSON. Parse it for me and pass the parsed result to my handler function. And my handler function just calls makeList based on the information it got from the server. MakeList, as we just saw interactively, returns a string. So we take that result and we insert it into the page with HTML. Okay, and then we have a button to start off the process, and we have a region where the results are going to be inserted. So now we're ready to try it. When we press the push button, it will fire off a request to the server. The server will return a string containing JSON. That JSON will automatically be parsed by jQuery because we said data type JSON. It gets passed to our handler function. Our handler function looks inside of it and extracts some information, then builds a string with a UL list and inserts that UL list into the page. And since my server-side program randomizes the data, if I call it again, the foreground color, the background color, the font size, and the numbers can change.